Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today we're talking Joe Abercrombie's The Trouble with Peace. This is book 2 in the Age of Madness Trilogy. I want to begin with what might be a somewhat controversial statement, and that is that I'm not sure that Joe Abercrombie, aka Lord Grimdark, is actually the grimdarkiest or grimdarkest of authors out there. I spend more time laughing while reading Joe Abercrombie's books than I do reading the books of just about any other author. And I know that grimdark can be funny, and Abercrombie's books definitely have their share of grim moments and violence with what some might consider to be a sort of cynical view of humanity. But I suspect that Joe Abercrombie actually likes people. And because of the humor and the violence, it's possible that the understanding of human nature that he expresses so beautifully in his books is underrated. And it's really just definitely not violence for the sake of entertainment. Now, I'm not saying that is what grimdark is. In fact, actually, I really would welcome your comments. What is grimdark anyway? What defines grimdark? And I would especially love to hear from my buddy Slowly Red, the Wizard of Grimdark, who is maybe one of the best read persons I know in the genre or subgenre of Grimdark. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think. What is Grimdark? So let's begin with what Abercrombie does best: characters. I'm going to keep this general. I want to avoid spoilers for this video because it's a fairly recently published book. So I really do think, though, the characters are the best thing about Abercrombie's books, and he does them about as well as anyone. And there are two things that I think are particularly wonderful about what Abercrombie does with characters. And the first one is that he gives every one of his characters a distinct voice. I have this thing I like to call the dialogue test. And that is, if I just turn him to a random page in the book and I look at some dialogue without knowing who's doing the talking, could I tell which character that is? And I think with Abercrombie, the answer is going to be more often yes than no. He has just done a tremendously brilliant job in this book, The Trouble with Peace, and as he does in general with all of his books, of giving a very distinct flavor to each of his characters through the dialogue, through what other characters think of this character, through the internal musings of the character. He just does a beautiful job with that. The other thing that I think Abercrombie does as well as anyone is giving his characters internal conflict, which is pretty much essential for a character in my book to be interesting. Now, The Trouble with Peace features actually, I think, some of his best character work to date, and that is saying a lot because this guy is really good at this. And especially the female characters who actually kind of steal the show for much of this book, much to my delight. I think he's done wonderful work with his female characters in The Trouble with Peace. And you could see that already in A Little Hatred, but now I think it's even better in The Trouble with Peace. So I'd like to start with Savine Dan Glocta, who is ruthless and mercenary and very perceptive as well. And she has enough of a conscience and a heart to actually make her a somewhat sympathetic character at times. I do find myself pulling for her. Her personal assistant, Zuri, also an interesting character, if not as well developed. She's a minor character, but an interesting character who does, I think, a great thing in keeping up that immigration theme that Abercrombie introduced in A Little Hatred. Really like what he's done with her, developing her, giving us little glimpses of her background. Some other minor characters that I thought Abercrombie did some beautiful work with on the female side. There was Savine's mother, R.D., who has a wonderful presence in this book. Although she's a minor character, I really love the scenes with her, as well as with Leo Dan Brock's mother, Finri. So I just love their scenes, these older women who have their own kind of cleverness. Also, perhaps my favorite, maybe one of my favorite characters, Rikke. I just love what Abercrombie's done with her in this book. She has some tremendous decisions to make in here. And no matter what, her decision, whichever way she goes, is going to leave her scarred and transformed. And the male characters develop beautifully in The Trouble with Peace as well. Leo Dan Brock is an excellent example of a character who, on paper, is somebody I would have a hard time liking. He's homophobic, he's a racist jock, and he completely lacks imagination. And yet, Abercrombie has me clutching the book, hoping against hope that Leo is not going to make the stupid decisions that he's about to make. Another of my favorite characters, right up there with Rike, is Orso, who is simply one of the most amiable and self-deprecating and accidentally wise persons you could meet in the First Law world, which is sort of ironic because he's also one of the most detested characters in the First Law world, which brings home yet another great theme that Abercrombie gets across beautifully in here, which is that the frequent disparity between perception and reality. He does just a wonderful job with this theme. Also, I love where Abercrombie takes some of the more minor, close to major, but definitely a perspective character is Gunnar Broad, and his intense inner conflict is a very personal and relatable example of what happens in a society built on exploitation, where social disparities between rich and poor have grown so vast that uncountable tragedies result. There are moments of laughter that alternate with moments of deep and moving tragedy. I was just incredibly invested in these characters. But I do have one small quibble, one little critique, and that is the overuse of one technique that is usually an effective way to show the difference between appearance and truth. And that is having a character say one thing and think another. And it's a great way to portray hypocrisy and dishonesty, self-deception, conflict, but it happens just a little too often for my taste, and we get that the characters are pretending more often than not. But sometimes there's just a whole string of these moments, this sort of back and forth between say one thing, think another, say one thing, think another. And almost every character has those. That's just probably my only minor quibble with this magnificent book, though. Now on to one of Abercrombie's other great strengths, and that is action. The Trouble with Peace features Abercrombie's trademark genius when it comes to action scenes, most especially in the shifting character perspectives during the most intense moments of the book. I also like how in these big moments, Abercrombie zooms into the perspective of minor characters who humanize the action, and they make it more gripping and give the reader something to latch onto. The last 100 pages or so of the book are breathtaking, but really the whole book is paced extremely well. I mentioned a couple of the themes in here, and Abercrombie has done, once again, a deceptively deep job with these themes. There are the Dickensian notes that I saw in A Little Hatred, and they are still there with the class conflict, which continues to be a major theme in here. But there's also a nod to Shakespeare. There's a kind of a Henry V type thing going on, and I don't want to say too much about that, but that is definitely a very, very prominent narrative in here. There's also vengeance and its repercussions portrayed magnificently. Again, I don't want to give too many details because I'm avoiding spoilers here, but I think Abercrombie's books are much more than just entertaining. He's an excellent observer of human psychology, and though he was already among my favorite authors, he just keeps getting better and better. I highly recommend The Trouble with Peace. Of course, you'd want to read A Little Hatred first. In fact, I would say, once again, you should start with the First Law trilogy and then read the standalones. You might want to pick up the short story collection, Sharp Ends, as well. So that wraps it up for today. In the very near future, I will be reviewing a Robin Hobb book, back to another one of my favorite authors. I'm going to be looking at the first book of the Live Ship Traders trilogy, Ship of Magic, I think it's called. I'm going to be starting that today, and hopefully within a week or so, giving you a review of that. So I hope to see you again, and if you enjoy this kind of content, please do consider liking and subscribing. Until next time.